key points that would be useful to understand. Yeah, it's recording. Yeah, so I thought I'd just hit some of the main key points that would be important to understand as basically any member on the team. Obviously, if once you're in Aero, you can get deeper into different things, but this would be a general understanding so that you understand how aerodynamics work, how it interacts with the vehicle itself, and why we need it exactly. So, okay, so basically, what is aerodynamics and why is it important to us? So aerodynamics generally, it basically comes under the field of fluid mechanics, and in our case, that fluid is air. So basically, the textbook definition is aerodynamics is a study of how gases interact with moving bodies, and because that gas we encounter most is air, aerodynamics is primarily concerned with the forces of drag and lift, which are caused by air passing over and around solid bodies. So in our case, we actually have somewhat of a problem compared to, say, a plane, for example, or a ship. Race cars are unique. Actually, cars in general are unique in that they uh, operate on the ground and in the air, which basically causes like double the headache. Planes, most of the time operate in air itself, so you can basically optimize it towards operating in that condition. Ships are in the water, you can optimize it for that condition. Cars are a bit trickier because you have to deal with interactions of the tires to the road, but you also have to deal with interactions of airflow around the body and how it affects the handling and performance of the car. And then there's also the combined effects of um, the ground effects and the effects caused by the air. Um, for race cars, in our case, we're generally concerned with internal and external flows. So external flows are things that basically, as the air moves around the outside of the body, um, so around the wings, around the chassis, the tires, that sort of stuff. While internal flows would be more concerned with the radiator, for example. If you had a radiator duct, that's an internal flow. Um, if you get more into it, I guess this would be outside the scopes of aerodynamics on our team, but this would be more on the powertrain side. But internal flow inside the intake um, is another type of internal flow. You also have, if you choose to do it, brake duct cooling. That's also an internal flow. The fundamentals are the same if you're internal or external, but there are slight differences where you have to adjust for different variables depending on which type of flow you are working with. So it's just a picture of a car with air going around it. So basically, how does it affect a race car? So there's two main factors that we're generally concerned about, which is downforce and drag. So in the presentation, I'm going to be using lift and downforce interchangeably. Lift is basically the upward force that's created by the movement of a body through air. We're more concerned with downforce, which is basically just negative lift. So whichever one I use, in our case, I'm just referring to downforce. In like future slides, I'll be going through the actual like fundamentals of aerodynamics, and in that case, I'm going to be using more of the aerospace definitions, which are all involved with lift as an upward force, but the same thing applies to downforce. Just flip it. So basically, yeah, we're concerned with downforce and drag, both which are proportional to velocity squared. So this is a really important thing to note: is drag and downforce both increase with velocity squared. So if you go twice as fast, your downforce and drag also double. I mean, they they multiply by 4 times. Like, it's an exponential relation. So this becomes more important when you're running at higher speeds. For example, if you're in Formula One or any of the other racing series, lift and downforce, downforce and drag both get substantially more important than in our case where we're running at lower speeds. That being said, it still is an important consideration, even at our speeds. So drag is an aerodynamic force that opposes an object's motion through the air. Basically, this is important to us because when we're driving forward, for example, if we didn't have air resistance, the only thing we'd have would be rolling resistance, for example, or inertia in the engine. But that being said, when we're traveling through a medium such as air, there is some resistance to us moving forward. You can kind of see this, like if you're driving down the highway and you stick your hand out of the car and you face your palm into the wind, you'll feel that your hand gets pushed back, and that's just a resistance with the air, also known as drag. So in our case, for a race car or any car in general, to overcome this drag, we apply more power. So this becomes an important factor in the top speeds that you can hit, for example. And this is why a lot of cars that do try and break land speed records, for example, are very streamlined to basically reduce the resistance that's caused on the actual car itself. And it does dictate the shape pretty strongly. Once again, like in our case, it doesn't play a huge factor in dictating the shape, both because we operate at lower speeds, and because we generally have an excess of power to overcome a lot of the drag. But the more in depth you get into aero, and the more you try and tweak your car to be aerodynamically efficient, that does become a concern. The other force that we're really concerned about is downforce, and that's the vertical force caused by interaction of the air with the vehicle. In our case, to basically push the car into the ground. And this basically helps us because it allows us to go faster through corners by increasing the vertical load on the tires, increasing grip, but this is without adding any extra mass itself. So I'm going to get more into that in later slides, but just as an overall thing, the downforce is a vertical force that's pushing the car into the ground in essence. And yeah, like I said before, internal flows such as the engine intake, cooling, brakes, radiator, all those things are affected by the airflow over the car. And those are pretty primary concerns. We haven't gone like super deep into it, but the more the aerodynamic knowledge increases, the more you can look into those things to basically try and improve those variables. For example, in intake or radiator cooling, you can make it smaller, have a more efficient duct, all those sorts of things. So basically, how does downforce make us go faster? So you can basically see, okay, well, I'll show you basically using this graph. And this is from one of the papers that I recommended to read for Aero. And he explains it pretty well, but you basically have a rolling tire. Sorry. Yeah, so you're basically heading in this X direction here, but you're, say, for example, cornering. So you're gonna have a certain angle created, certain slip angle, and then you're also gonna have a lateral force on the tire in the Y direction. So basically, let's assume that the vehicle weight is 200 kilograms, right? So basically between 0 and 5 degrees, sorry, this thing is in the way. So basically between 0 and 5 degrees is where you're still going to have a slip angle, is where you'll still be able to maintain traction. And generally after 5 degrees, you're going to be sliding. So you want to stay within that 0 to 5 degrees of slip angle. So for a given weight, so for example, say this is somewhere around like 4.5 degrees with a car with a vertical load of 200 kilograms on the tires, you'd have a lateral side force, basically your cornering force of, where it's like something about 140 kilograms. Now, if you add more vertical load to the tire for the same slip angle, you'll have somewhere around 200 and maybe 230 kilograms of lateral force. So basically, there's two ways you can do this. You can either increase the actual mass of the car, thereby increasing the vertical load on the tires, but what comes with that is that now you also have more inertia just in general to accelerate, to brake, to turn into a corner. So you're just that extra mass will slow you down in terms of accelerating up to a certain speed, slowing down from a certain speed. So you generally don't want that extra weight because it does add inertia. So how else can we add that extra vertical load? And that's what we do, is basically by using the interaction of the air with the actual wings of the car to generate a downwards force that does apply more vertical load to the tire without adding actual inertia to the car itself. And you can see here, for example, to achieve the same lateral side force, now you need to be at a smaller slip angle. So basically, this means you can run the car harder and achieve greater lateral side forces, meaning that you can generally corner at a faster speed. Yeah, basically that's how this is how it allows us to basically corner faster. And I apply this to four wheels, and you can see and the magnitudes of these forces is you can, depending on the speeds you go at, like once again, like I said, with more velocity you generate more downforce. So for example, if you had like 100 kilogram difference, we generally don't see 100 kilogram difference per tire, just because we don't produce that much downforce. But for faster cars, for example Formula One, uh, they produce quite a bit more downforce, so it becomes huge for them. Okay, so basically, so now we know downforce, how do we produce it? So generally, the most common way is that you see on most cars is wings, and a wing is basically a 3D how do you say it? A 3D accumulation of these 2D airfoil profiles. So for example, what you see here, this is an airfoil profile. So imagine you were to cut a wing in the cross section, and this is what you see from the side view. So it's basically, we use airfoils and aerodynamics to basically simplify and use for 2D analysis, and then that gets expanded into a 3D analysis with a full wing. And basically, what an airfoil is a streamlined shape that produces more lift than drag using a pressure differential. So you could you could basically use a flat plate and still generate lift. For example, a flat plate at a certain angle, but you're gonna have substantially more drag as well. So if you think of a flat plate, again, think of sticking your hand out the window when you're driving down the road. And if you put your your hand out the car with your thumb facing forward. So basically, your palm is facing down. Um, you'll see that nothing really happens. Now, if you put your angle, if you put your hand up at an angle a bit, you'll notice that your hand gets lifted up and back. So basically, that's the lift and drag forces both acting on your hand in that case. So basically, any body will interact with the air in a certain way. An airfoil is basically, you could say, a optimized shape um, that basically allows more lift and drag to be produced. So how is lift um, produced? So this is kind of a tricky thing because there's a lot of different explanations that are out there, but the two biggest things that influence how lift is produced over an airfoil are Newton's laws and Bernoulli's principles. So you might have heard about different explanations for lift, where they say how the air travels over the faster over the top and slower over the bottom, uh, and the particles reach the. So, for example, if you had a single particle, they both have to reach the end at the trailing edge at the same time, and that causes the particle over the top to go faster and the one over the bottom to go slower. So you're going to have higher pressure at the bottom and lower pressure at the top. That's actually not true. I mean, you can see here, if you had like a given particle, there's nothing to say that a certain particle has to reach the trailing edge faster. So I mean, if you were to look at one of these lines, you'll notice how at the top the particles do travel faster and slower at the bottom. So that's generally not a good explanation for it, but basically using Newton's laws. Yeah, so basically, using Newton's laws, you can say that the airflow will generate lift by exerting a downwards force on the air as the air flows past it. So, for example, if you look here, you can see that the airfoil is sort of deflecting the flow a bit downwards, and in turn, the uh, the air will exert an equal and opposite upwards force on the airfoil, which will cause it to produce lift. So this is a part of the explanation. The other part of the explanation has to do with Bernoulli's principle. And if you're to look at a given streamline, for example, so let's say that these horizontal, if you're to look at a constant horizontal path of particles, that's where you're going to define as a streamline. So for a given streamline, you'll see that as the particles flow over the top, they're going to go faster, while as the particles go over the bottom, they're going to go slower. And therefore, according to Bernoulli's principle, if you have a velocity particle going faster, then it's going to produce a lower pressure, and a velocity particle going slower is going to produce a higher pressure. Now, you have to note that these pressures are in relation to the normal atmospheric pressure. Oh, there's a pointer. Ah, cool, nice. Thanks, Rob. So this is in relation to the atmospheric pressure that's uh, around it. So let's say the atmospheric pressure just somewhere here is 0. We'll talk in gauge pressure. So this is just 0 here. Now, as the air travels faster over here, say this becomes -5 in Pascal. And as it goes slower here, it gets higher than the atmospheric pressure, let's say +5. And now this net difference in pressures, +5 higher on the bottom and -5 lower on the top, is going to exert an upwards force on the actual airfoil itself. And in our case, the airfoils are basically flipped, so the opposite happens. You're going to have a higher pressure at the top and a lower pressure at the bottom, pushing the airfoil down into the ground. Now, you can also think of it this way: is like, why does it go faster here and slower here? So if you're to look at this box, right, this you can think of as a control volume. Do you guys understand what a control volume is? If you've taken fluids, it probably makes sense. So in this control volume, right, you have your fluid and then you have your actual object. Now, if you look at the distance between here and here in the control volume for this airfoil with the camber shape it has and everything, if you look between here and here, you'll see that it is a smaller distance than it is between the bottom surface and this bottom edge of the actual control volume. So you can think of this in like in terms of a Venturi tube, where this is more of a constriction than the bottom here, and in turn you're going to have this constriction cause the flow to accelerate and speed up versus the flow on the bottom. Now, you remember, you're just looking at a certain control volume, and this contraction and not contraction here is basically caused by the shape of the airfoil itself. So the camber here. Now, these are basically sort of basic explanations of how lift work. All these things combined are basically the fundamental physical principles behind lift generations. There isn't a single exact answer that, you know what, because of this and this is why lift is produced. There's a lot of interactions that play into it, especially with mathematical equations and calculus, but these are ways that we can bring it down to physical principles to actually understand what's going on. Now, looking at an airfoil itself, you have a few general characteristics. So you're going to have the chord line, which is basically the distance from the leading edge to the trailing edge. And this is just going to be a straight line across from leading to trailing edge. Then you have the camber line, which also goes from leading to trailing edge, but it describes the actual curvature of the airfoil. So you'll see that this airfoil here, for example, is more flat at the bottom and more curved at the top. So we say that this airfoil has a given camber to it. I know you guys just camber in VD as well, but this is a different type of camber. So yeah, the camber basically describes the curvature of the airfoil. So a larger camber will mean an airfoil that's curved a lot more aggressively from the leading to the trailing edge. And then you have your thickness, which is basically the thickness between the upper and lower surface. And you generally have and generally you'll most airfoils with camber will have a maximum thickness point. So for example, here it would be somewhere about there. And that's usually where the flow is turned the most, or the quickest, if you want to say. And then the other important variable is the angle of attack. So in aerodynamics, we talk of in terms of relative wind. So for example, if this would be the direction of the flow of the air, and the airfoil is inclined at a given angle of attack to the actual relative wind. Now we say relative wind because the air doesn't always come like this, just coming from the forward direction. If you have wind, for example, it can come in at a different angle. If you look on our car, for example, as the air comes around the top of the intake, it actually comes at a downwards angle to the actual first element of the rear wing. So the relative wind in that case is not to the horizontal. I mean, the angle of attack we use in that case is not technically defined to the horizontal. It's actually defined to the direction that the air would be coming towards the leading edge. So that's an important thing to note, is that it's the relative wind and not just the absolute horizontal direction that's your angle of attack. And basically putting an airfoil at an angle of attack causes the air to turn. You can either cause the air to turn a lot more or less, for example. So here you can see that this airfoil is slightly tilted at a positive angle of attack. So you have a slight turning. Now, if you're to increase the angle of attack of this, the airflow coming to the leading edge would actually be turned a lot more to make it around the actual airfoil. So Rob, we can actually see when we use CFD where the actual airflow is coming from, and then account our angle of attack to basically mitigate that effect of the changing relative wind. So actually, in our basic CFD simulations, we assume a headwind coming from straight in front, just because it makes it computationally easier. But when we do yaw cases or cases when the car is at an angle, then we do have to consider airflow coming in at a different angle to the actual vehicle. And yeah, one final point to note here is that what happens with air when it encounters a body, for example, is that pressure waves from the let me try to explain this one. So as an air particle reaches so for example, here it's just flowing, it's just chilling, whatever. As it reaches a body in the flow, this first air particle is going to actually, for example, see, in quotation marks, is going to see this body in front of it, and because it's moving slower than the speed of sound, what's going to happen is it's going to cause a pressure wave that moves rearwards. So that pressure wave is going to basically move rearwards from the actual body, and basically, in essence, what you can think of this as is that the airflow that's just meeting the body is kind of warning the air particles behind it that, yo guys, there's something coming up. We gotta turn around this thing. So that's why you'll notice that when you look at, if you look at like wind tunnel flow visualizations of things going around airfoils and stuff like that, that the airflow doesn't actually reach the body and then turn. It starts turning from before. So even if you look at this figure, for example, you can see that the actual airflow is starting to move in at an angle to try and make it around the actual airfoil. It's not coming here and then making like a quick turn. It sort of, you can say in quotation, knows that there's an object coming in front of it, and it starts to turn a bit earlier. And this is sort of more exaggerated the more blunt of an object you have. So if there's something sharp, it doesn't turn around as easily. But if you have like a sphere, for example, here instead of the airfoil, you'll see that the flow starts to turn a lot earlier before actually meeting the body itself. I don't know if that made full sense. Um, it's not like super essential, but it's a good thing to know. Hopefully, it made sense. Okay, so basically, when we have an airfoil, so like I was saying before, if you guys saw here, this was a cambered airfoil. This is a symmetric airfoil. It has no no camber, no curvature to the airfoil from like bottom to top. So you can see that the top and bottom are both the same. So the camber line is going to be exactly where the chord line is. And then this is a very heavily cambered airfoil that has a pretty large curvature. So an important consideration that we have when you're using a wing on the car, for example, is the angle of attack that you set it at. So like I said here, this force that produces lift is caused by a pressure differential, right? You have lower pressure here, higher pressure here, and you're going to have upwards force. Now that's dependent on the velocity, right? So the faster this airflow here travels, the lower pressure that will be produced here and more of a pressure difference between the top and the bottom, aka more force. Now, how do you make it go faster? If you increase the angle of attack, the flow has to turn around a bigger curvature. It has to make that turn a lot quicker around this actual airfoil itself. And what that's going to cause it to do is it's going to cause it to accelerate even more and go faster and create less pressure, more lift. So basically, that's why we generally increase the angle of attack to produce more lift. Now this does have a limit. You can keep increasing the angle of attack, but at a point, what happens is that the angle is so steep that the flow can't actually turn around the actual object, and it's like, peace out, I can't do this, and it just separates. So for example, here you can see the flow is going around the whole object, makes it to the end. Nice. You increase the angle of attack to 15 degrees, and you're going to have some slight separation. You increase it to 25 degrees, and your flow's fully separated. Now, you'll know how it says maximum lift. So when you do increase your angle of attack, your maximum lift will generally be around where your stall point is. So you will have a slight bit of separation. Now that slight bit of separation is okay, because overall the negative effects of the small separation are outweighed by the amount of lift you're getting. But it's sort of playing with fire, keeping it at an angle like this at maximum lift, because any little increase in the angle of attack, say for example you hit a bump or whatever, something like that, and this is going to fully separate. So you usually want to stay generally a bit under the limit to give yourself a little cushion between separation. Otherwise, yeah, it's very easy to separate. So I'll just quickly explain how and why separation works. So you have this air here with a given energy, right? And as it goes around this curvature here, what's basically happening is that the velocity increases, and you have low pressure here, right? Now remember how I said these pressures are relative to the atmospheric pressure around the airfoil. So for example, here we have the atmospheric pressure, for example, again, let's say 0, here it's 0, here it's -5, and here it's 5. So in nature in general, and in aerodynamics, things want to move from a state of high to low. So in this case, things want to move from high pressure to low pressure. That's just the natural pressure gradient from high to low. So for example, if you look here, this pressure here of -5, of +5, for example, is higher than the atmospheric pressure of 0. So the flow from here wants to move towards the trailing edge. Now here, where the pressure, for example, would be -5, and here at the trailing edge is 0, this is moving against the natural pressure gradient, right? Things want to go from high to low, not from low to high. So how does it overcome this? It basically makes it to the trailing edge because of its kinetic energy, right? Because it has a certain kinetic energy, there's a negative pressure gradient working against it, which in aerodynamics we call an adverse pressure gradient. And it's basically working, the kinetic energy from the flow is working to overcome that negative pressure gradient to make it to the trailing edge. So an analogy that you'll generally see used is bike, like if you're at the top of a hill on a bike, you'll naturally want to, if you go down the hill, the natural inclination is to roll down the hill. Nature will make you roll down the hill, gravitational energy, but same thing with gravitational. You want to go from a point of high gravitational potential energy to low gravitational potential energy. That's just the natural way things work. So what's happening on the upper surface is as if you're going up the hill, right? Now, if the hill is small, right? So small angle of attack, not a big difference between this negative pressure here and the back. The hill is small. You can generally easily bike up it to the top of the hill, which will be like the trailing edge in this case. And say you were coming down another hill initially, right? You came down this like big hill, and now you have a tiny. You reach the bottom of this hill, and now there's another hill. It's a tiny hill. Your kinetic energy, your momentum, will allow you to basically climb up that second tiny hill easily. And in this case, it's the same thing. The kinetic energy of the flow will allow it to overcome that negative pressure gradient, make it to the edge easily. Now, when you have a very steep angle of attack, this pressure up here, the negative pressure, for example, let's say now it's like negative 50, right? And so here it's still 0. So now it has a way bigger pressure gradient to overcome. And this would be, for example, you had your, let's say, hill 1, you went down hill 1, and hill 2 now is like double the height of hill 1. Your momentum, there's no way your own momentum is going to make you basically roll up that second hill. You can't. You're going to reach up to a certain point, and then you'll fall back. And that's basically what separation is that the pressure gradient between the the upper surface here and atmospheric is just too high for the kinetic energy of the flow to overcome, and it's like, peace out, I'm dipping, I'm leaving. And that's how you get separated flow. So you can look here as an example. This is your angle of attack, and this is your CL. Let's just say it's lift for now. As you increase your angle of attack, your lift's going to increase, lift's going to increase, lift's going to increase, up until a certain point where you reach your maximum lift. You increase the angle of attack any more than that, and you're going to have a substantial drop in lift, and that's basically due to the stall. And this is the symmetric airfoil. With a cambered airfoil, you'll notice here at a 0-degree angle of attack, you're actually going to be able to produce lift. While here at 0 degrees, you're not producing any lift. And that's just due to the shape of the airfoil itself. You actually have to be at a negative angle of attack to produce 0 lift. So that's why generally cambered airfoils will allow you to have a larger range to work within. Okay, cool. So now we can look. Actually, first we'll talk about drag. So with lift, you also get drag, right? There's nothing for free. There's going to be a byproduct to the lift you're getting. So you can basically divide the drag into 2 types: profile and induced. So profile drag is basically does wind affect aerodynamics? Yes, it does. So because the the wind does affect aerodynamics because wind is basically moving air. So for example, if you were let's say in airplane sitting on the runway, right? It's not on anything. It's just kind of chilling there, and there's like 100 km/h wind. The wings are going to produce lift, right? Even though the plane's not moving, the air relative to the wind, I mean the the air relative to the body is moving. The air is moving over the body due to the wind, and that will cause interactions. So, for example, a plane sitting on runway will produce lift, even if it's not moving, because the wing itself doesn't see if you're physically moving or not on the ground. The wing only sees airspeed, right? So if you're just sitting on the wing, like sitting at the leading edge of the wing, um, what you see is just the actual air that's coming over the wing. Doesn't matter if you're moving or not. As long as the air is moving, there's going to be interactions between uh, different bodies and the air. Okay, so basically you have profile drag, which is basically related to is broken down into form drag and frictional drag. So form drag is basically the drag caused by the actual shape of the object itself. So you can see here, like if you just put a flat plate into the air, like your hand out the window, there's a large form drag because there's a large area um, that the air is hitting. If you have a more streamlined body, for example, an airfoil, you're going to have a small form drag because the frontal area of the actual uh, object is smaller, but you're also sort of grooming the air around the shape. You're not just like making it hit a wall. You're kind of grooming the air and making sure it doesn't separate around the actual body. So that's one source of profile drag. Then you also have frictional drag, which has to do with the actual surface of the um, body itself. So something that's very rough uh, is going to have very like a lot of like little dips and valleys in it, and it's going to cause the air to basically catch up on it. Uh, Sort of like, I don't know, like sandpaper, right? If you like run like a silk sheet over sandpaper, it's going to cause it to catch a lot. You can think of that the same way in the air. It causes little turbulations in the air, and that causes a larger drag. A smooth surface, the air can flow over it really nicely, doesn't have anything in its way, and it just flows right over. Low frictional drag. The other drag is induced drag. Now, the induced, so profile drag comes from if you're looking at the object in 2D. It's I mean it's a 3D phenomenon as well, but it works in 2D as well. So for example here, like all these airfoils we're looking at are 2D. We're looking at 2D cross sections, right? And profile and form drag, profile drag basically can be described here. Now when you move a wing to 3D, there's other effects that come up, right? When you expand it out into 3 dimensions. And one of them is induced drag. And these are what you might have seen them on planes or on Formula One cars, like when it's like damp weather. These are those vortices that come off the actual wingtip. And this happens because if you think about it, you have a high pressure at the bottom and you have a low pressure at the top, right? So, like I said before, air wants to move from high pressure to low pressure. So, there's no physical barrier here on the actual end of the wing. So, there's nothing stopping the actual air, the high pressure air, from coming from the bottom surface and sort of rolling over onto the top surface where there's low pressure, right? And then as the actual wing moves forward, this rotational movement gets expanded out, and it basically turns into uh, tip vortices, right? And these vortices cause a certain drag to be uh, produced. I'm not going to go too in depth into wingtip vortices drags because it gets a bit tricky, but just know that the formation of these vortices does cause drag on the actual wing itself. Now you might think, okay, what if we just put something here to stop it from leaking over? And that's literally exactly what we do. That's one of the biggest reasons why we have end plates. One of the reasons is to actually hold all the wings together. But the other big reason you'll see is, for example, why end plates are like huge, even though like the wing is up here in like the top whatever third, but the end plate extends down almost to the tire. It's basically to lower the effect of this happening, right? Because it does cause drag. We want to try and reduce it, and you'll see this on airplanes as well. When you see on the tips of the airplanes, you'll see little like wingtip vortices where like the end of the wing kind of like points up, and it's a similar reason. You're basically trying to reduce the induced drag. So all of these effects combined cause drag and um, basically limit the movement of the car forward. So we want to try and reduce most of that as possible so that we have less of a power demand. So in aerodynamics in general, we use non-dimensional coefficients to compare between a lot of things. And these are used to determine the characteristics of an actual wing or body in general. And aerodynamic coefficients allow comparison between different objects, right? Different sized objects, different environmental operating conditions, different speeds, right? So you can basically cut all those out and look at the CL of, if you look at the CL of one object and the CL of a different object, two totally different objects, you can directly compare them because they have been non-dimensionalized by all these variables here. So it's a ratio of forces as opposed to a straight out force itself. So, for example, if we look at the coefficient of lift, it's the lift force divided by half the density, velocity squared, and this is the actual area of the body, right? So if you're dividing by density, that's the air density, and air density obviously has an effect on the aerodynamics because a more dense fluid will be able to produce for like say for a given amount of time, more particles of air are flowing over the wing, you can produce more force, whereas when it's less dense you'll produce less force. So basically you can have different operating conditions. By dividing by density, you're cutting that out. You obviously could have the airflow going at different velocities. You're also cutting that out. And objects of different areas, right? You could have a wing that's has a 1 meter chord and a wing that has like a 50-meter chord. If you divide the lift force by the actual respective areas and velocities and densities, you can directly compare the efficiency and the amount of lift the 1 meter wing produces to that 50-meter wing, right? You can directly compare them, even though they're different sizes. One's flying at like 10,000 feet, one's flying at sea level, and one's flying at 10 meters per second, the other one's flying at 100. You can directly compare these two by non-dimensionalizing, which is why we even in general in aerodynamics, most of the time people won't talk in direct outright forces. They talk in terms of coefficients, like this thing has a CL of this and a CD of this. So the main things of concern to us are the coefficient of lift and the coefficient of drag, which is CD. All right, so multi-element wings. Why do we use multi-element wings? Because we can extract more downforce within a given area, right? We're generally limited by the amount of area we have by rules. Like we only have a certain area between the tires, between the rear tires, for example, and a certain height from the ground, and we can only work within that area. So what can we do to try and improve it? You can have a single element there. It would still work, but you can make it better, right? And it generally consists of a main plane, so one main, usually larger element, and then smaller flap elements. And the underlying principles of the multi-element wing on our cars, for example, has the same principles as flaps on an aircraft when you're coming up to land or take off and the flaps come out. It's the same. The fundamentals behind it are the same. So if you look at this, this is I don't even know if this is an FSA car. It looks kind of like it. I don't know if anyone's seen this before, but this is just like an outrageously large aero package with a lot of multi-element wings. Definitely against the rules in our case, and it probably acts as a giant air brake. Yeah, it actually does look like the Wright brothers plane. Well, let's talk about. Oh, can you ask a quick vortices question? Yes, Tina. Yes, they can. I mean, they're not gonna usually. They wouldn't technically negate each other fully. Um, partially because if you have, I mean, unless you had the two vortices stemming like really, really close to each other, um, then they would basically negate each other's effects a bit earlier. But generally, if you have um, counter rotating vortices, it would be a lot farther back that they'd meet. Now that being said, it still does because the vortices still do have an effect on the wing even after the wing has passed. It's kind of weird to understand, but even after a wing is passed, that vortice still has an effect on the actual wing. So yes, it would be able to reduce that effect, but not 100% because closer to the actual root of the vortice, you still have that independent vortice acting there, right? Because I mean, you wouldn't be able to create both vortices off like the exact same plane. Um, okay, so basically with a multi-element wing, right? Uh, we we're basically what we're doing is we're increasing the plan area, which is like the overall area of the wing, and like you guys saw uh, here, increasing the area of the wing um, does give you more lift. So think of this. Okay, so imagine multiplying this the denominator by CL, and that equals a lift force, right? What encompasses a CL is basically the angle of attack of the wing, the camber of the wing, basically the shape of the actual airfoil itself, and then multiplied by these things. So if you multiply the CL by a higher velocity, you're going to get more lift. Multiply it by a higher density, you're going to get more lift. Bigger area, you're going to get more lift. And that also applies to drag. The drag equation is exactly the same, except a CD, and here there's the drag force instead of the lift force. So, um, so you can see that basically increasing the area of the wing will give you more lift. Increasing the camber will also give you more lift, and the camber is encompassed within that CL term. So now, if we're to look at this figure here, right? This is from leading edge to the trailing edge of the main element, and then you have your flap element. Now this is two elements. Now imagine you had a single element, right? That was this size and this camber, right? So you can see here on the side, this is a single element with the same camber, with the same effective camber and chord as this multi-element airfoil, and you can see like with that very big camber and long chord length, the flow can't stay attached. It's just a CFD visualization, and these are just streamlined, but you can see that with that aggressive of camber distribution, it can't the flow can't stay attached. It becomes too hard for it to stay attached because you're turning it way too hard. What you're doing with a multi-element wing is that you're basically again like sort of grooming it. You're uh, effectively this is your whole camber and this is your chord. So in essence, it's as if you have this sort of camber, but you're like cheating the system and allowing it to stay uh, attached for a longer time. So even if you look at the downforce numbers, run 1,300 something newtons versus 1,500 something ish newtons. So there's different effects that play in to what happens here. So first two are that the actual area and camber are both increased. Second, you'll notice that there's this narrow gap between the trailing edge of the main element and the leading edge of the flap element, right? And when you're doing a multi-element wing, you always have to make sure to have the trailing edge, I mean the flap, overlap the main plane element, right? And this is important because what it effectively does is that it creates this little converging gap, sort of like a Venturi tube, right? And what it allows the air to do is that the air that's leaving the upper surface of the main plane gets accelerated because of this converging gap, and it basically re-energizes the air as it flows under the lower side of the flap element. So just to be clarifying in this case, this is an actual race car wing. So we have a high pressure on top and low pressure at the bottom. So pulling the wing downwards. Yeah. So basically, what's happening is that as a flow here loses energy because of the adverse pressure gradient over the bottom surface, right? It's like losing energy here and it's coming here. And this high pressure air from the top is being accelerated. And as it accelerates, it becomes more of a low pressure air, higher energy. And it combines with this air. And what happens is that it basically re energizes the air that's coming from here to be able to make it to the end of the actual airfoil, right? If you didn't have the gap, it becomes hard for the air to make it to the end because it's fighting like a pretty steep adverse pressure gradient. So what you're doing here is you're just kind of giving it a little bump. You're you're adding a little bit more energy to the flow so it can make it to the end, right? If you look back at the hill analogy, it's like say you're going up the hill, it's very steep and just rolling up won't help and you kind of get stuck halfway. What you're basically doing is that you're starting to pedal a bit to bring yourself, giving yourself more energy to bring yourself up towards all the way to the top of the hill. So you're basically re-energizing the flow using this gap here, and this is like a very important consideration. So there's um a lot of like textbook stuff on what this gap should be, how much it should overlap, what the size of the flap should be, but a lot of it is still trial and error based on your actual type of airfoil that you have, profiles that you have for this and this, and you kind of have to work around and play around with it and try and get it to uh, a sort of gap that works the best for your scenario, right? And what this flap is doing is it's also turning the air here and reducing the adverse pressure gradient. So if you think back to when I said the flow knows what's coming ahead of it, right? So due to this flap and this low pressure region here and the curvature of the actual flap itself, the air that's here at the trailing edge of the main plane sees that there's a curve coming up ahead of it, and the flow here is actually prematurely, you can say, turned. And remember, when you turn a flow, it generally speeds up and creates a lower pressure region and gains a bit more energy so that it can stay attached all the way till the end. So the flap also has that effect of turning the airflow before it reaches the trailing edge to basically give it a little boost of energy. Um, so you're really giving, this flap is really giving the flow a little bit more energy in different ways to make it towards the end. And the other thing is that the wake that's a little bit lower off like the surface of the main plane is actually kept away from the uh, the air that's under the flap, right? So if you're to look, it's like down like a bit lower, like say outside the scope of this um, slide. If you had the wake there, that's generally going to curve a bit because of the flap, but it's going to stay out of the way of the actual air that's around the flap here, and it's not going to disturb it, so it can stay clean and make it towards the end. Okay, now we get to ground effect and front wing. So Most of that stuff I was talking about applies to rear wings. It obviously applies to the front wing as well because we still use airfoils. But on a front wing, we have another effect, also known as ground effect, which actually helps us a lot. And you can basically think of the wing ground system as a Venturi system. So say this is the ground, for example, and this is your wing. What's happening is that you're basically creating a contraction region. Shoots, the pointer's right and the background's right. What's happening is you're basically creating a contraction region between the ground and the bottom surface of the airfoil. And what that's again going to do is going to accelerate the flow and create a high, like even more of a low pressure region than this airfoil would if it wasn't close to the ground, right? If it was just chilling out in free stream air. So it kind of creates like a suction force that produces more downforce. So generally, you can produce more downforce from the front wing. I mean, not more. Let's say it's easier to produce downforce with the front wing than it is with the rear wing, just because of the fact that the front wing operates in this ground effect, and you're getting a little like bonus downforce. And the closer the front wing is to the ground, the more downforce you're going to get produced, right? So, like this one here on the right would produce more downforce than this airfoil setup here on the left would, because it's closer to the ground. You're causing more of a constriction, which causes the airflow to accelerate even faster, up until you get too close to the ground, and then you're like not enough flow can get through that little gap, and then you just lose downforce, like right away. And yeah, you can basically see on this figure here, on the left of angle of attack versus the lift coefficient. So for a given angle of attack, say like whatever this line here, a wing that's not in ground effect is going to have a lower lift coefficient, right? For a given angle of attack, but at the same angle of attack, a wing in ground effect is going to have a higher lift coefficient. You're also going to see that the peaks themselves are translated. When you're working in ground effect, you can't push the wing to as hard of an angle of attack, right? Like remember how we said that you can increase the angle of attack up until a point where you reach a maximum lift, you stall, and then you lose lift. When you're in ground effect, because of this interaction with the ground, you actually can't take the let's see, you can't take the wing to as high of an angle of attack because it does stall a lot earlier, right? So let's say this was 10 degrees and this was like 15, right? You're gonna stall a lot earlier in ground effect. But generally, I mean, there's no need to push it even farther because you're already getting a bonus from the ground effect. So it sort of evens itself out. That's why you'll see a lot of front wings. If you look around at FSAE cars, they're not really very aggressive. They're just almost flat, to be honest. And you also notice that the closer, like say you have a 2-element front wing, the closer the actual main plane is to the ground, the less the flap does, if that makes sense. So like, yeah, the flap's producing a little bit of downforce, but when you get closer to the ground, what's happening is that contraction is accelerating the flow. You're really working the flow hard. You're extracting a lot of energy out of it, right? And because you're extracting so much energy out of it underneath the main element, by the time it reaches towards the flap element, it doesn't really have much energy to produce downforce on this flap element, right? And generally that flap element is used more for just kind of directing the air as opposed to outright producing downforce. You can see this in this graph. This is the total pressure, and the total pressure is just a measure of how much energy is contained within a flow. So here you'll look like the total pressure here is sort of green, somewhere around there, but when it's close to the ground, the total pressure underneath the flap is more on the blue spectrum, and it has a lot less energy contained in it. So anytime free stream air has a certain amount of energy because of its velocity, anytime it goes around and a body and exerts a force on it, you're extracting air because you have that conservation of energy, right? You're extracting energy from the air and it's being applied to the body to produce some sort of force. So the air loses energy. The ground effect is also used for the under tray, which is very important as well. All vehicles will have an aspect of underbody aerodynamics, right? Air, regardless if you're under tray or not, air is going to flow underneath the car. Now, if you have like a normal passenger vehicle, for example, the underside of the car is very rough. If you're going to say, like, in quotations, it's very rough because you have, like, the exhaust pipe, you have like the fuel tank. There's like a bunch of random things just sticking out, and that causes a lot of turbulence underneath the actual car, and it actually produces a high pressure region under the car, right? So most cars generally naturally produce lift by like the actual body itself because there's like this high pressure region in the car. Cars will, like, you're generally even our car, for example, no wings, nothing. Our car without, like, our, let's say, RF19, without any wings or anything, actually produces lift. I think it's something around 8 to 10 pounds of lift. So you can see, like, even a car like ours that has a smooth, and like we have like the floors underneath the car, so it's relatively smooth. It's still producing lift, right? So part of the reason we actually need downforce is firstly to negate that lift, and second to produce downforce for like cornering and stuff like that. So it generally, like, always sucks to have no form of aerodynamic downforce because your car is actually producing lift, so you're just losing out either way. Um, so there's three main factors that affect, how your underbody aerodynamics works, and that's the underbody roughness, like I said. So basically, how smooth the bottom of your car is versus how rough. The smoother it is, there'll probably be less lift produced. If it's rough, there's going to be more lift produced. The actual shape of the underbody and the ground clearance, right? So how close you are to the ground. In the same aspect I showed you in the last slide with the front wing, the closer you are to the ground, the more downforce you're going to produce up until a point. So if you look here, 20 millimeters, you're producing 3,500. 40 millimeters, you're producing 44, and then 100. So, like, this is the farthest ground clearance. You're producing 3,400 newtons. 40, you're decreasing the distance to the ground, more downforce. You decrease it even more, and the downforce decreases again because now you've choked the flow, right? You're restricting too much flow under the car. And then the underbody shape also affects how things work, right? So again, because the ground and the under tray is, you can think of a Venturi system, right? You can actually enhance that Venturi system by um, creating like an expanding area at the front, right? So where like air can come in, you can allow a lot of mass flow of air to come in. Then you contract it, right? So that it increases in velocity and decrease in pressure, and then you expand it out the back again with a diffuser. um, and generally, this is how most underbody aerodynamics works. So you have an entrance region, a throat, which is also known as where you have your contraction, and then a diffuser. The whole point of the diffuser is that you sped up this air a lot, and now what you're doing is you're basically slowing it down and expanding it back out, right? So that you're increasing the pressure of the air, so that when it reaches the atmospheric air at the back, it's almost at the same pressure. Because if you have this at a really low pressure and this at a very high pressure, what it's going to do is it's going to create a lot of drag, right? Because there's a huge pressure differential between what's coming out of the under tray and what's in the free stream behind the car itself. So the whole point of the diffuser is that you're just expanding the air back out, slowing it down, increasing the pressure, and making the jump in pressure from the under tray to the atmosphere as low as possible to reduce drag. Um, So see here, this is an example. I think it's UTA, like University of Texas Arlington's FSA car, where you'll see that they have this Venturi section. So you have to also think about it. You can actually laterally use the underside too, not just like longitudinally. So you'll see here, like you have this section, and then it contracts, and then you'll see how the diffuser expands out the back. But even laterally, from here to here, you can kind of cause a little bit of a contraction. You kind of have to play around with it and see how much you can contract the air. Most of the contraction you're going to get is from the actual interaction with the ground and not the lateral one. And you'll see here, you won't see many FSAE cars with this expansion, throat, and diffuser region down the center of the car. You'll see a lot of cars that will have it on the actual sides of the car, and this is like two reasons. You have more of an area along the sides to actually expand the air, because if you don't expand it enough, you start getting too much drag, and it just you get too much drag, and you actually lose downforce because you can't turn the flow as hard. Um, so because you don't have that much area out the back to expand it, for example, because you have like your diff, you have the jacking bar, there's not much physical space to expand it. So a lot of teams, what they'll do is do it on the sides because you have a lot more area, and you have more space to expand it, and then just leave the center section as flat as possible, right? So that you're not producing lift. You're maybe producing a little bit of downforce on the center because of being flat, but a lot of it will be produced along the sides. And you can see here how where it expands is generally where you're going to have the peak of downforce, right? So you'll see that it's the darkest blue here, where it basically goes from the contraction to the diffuser. That's where you're going to have the most downforce. So you also want to sort of plan out where to have your expansion region to be as close to your CG as possible. And one other thing why undertrays are good is because they have a high efficiency. They produce a lot of downforce, but not a lot of drag, right? Because there's not much form drag. There's nothing like this big thing that's sticking out in the air that's causing drag. It's very like discrete, right? So there's not much drag, and we're generally in aerodynamics talking efficiencies in terms of lift over drag ratio. So this undertrays have very good lift over drag ratios, very good efficiencies. For the amount of drag they produce, they produce substantially more lift. But outright, if you look at outright lift itself, front and rear wing package will generally produce more outright downforce. It's less efficient. For the amount of lift you produce, you're getting more drag, but outright you're generally producing more downforce with the front and rear wing package as opposed to an under tray itself, right? And that's one of the reasons why we, for example, when we had our first aero package, went with the front and rear wing, because from our lapsons we saw that we needed a lot more outright downforce as opposed to more efficiency in terms of like we had enough power to overcome the drag, but we needed more downforce, and we could get that with a front and rear wing package. So some just considerations to have an underground effect is downforce is very sensitive, especially when you're close to the limits in terms of ground clearance. So if you have it really close to the ground and you're close to that choking point, and say I don't your suspension compresses and you get too close to the ground, you lose all that downforce in an instant. Especially if you're going at really high speeds, that's like hundreds of pounds of downforce, right? And you can lose it all just like that, and that has pretty drastic effects. I'll show you a little video in a second. You the ground clearance on the front wing and the under tray is also changing dynamically, right, under pitch and roll. So for example, when you going from a stop and you're accelerating, the car pitches back, right? The distance from the ground to the front wing actually increases, right? So that changes the downforce on the front wing. Also, the distance between the entrance of the under tray and the ground changes, so that changes things up. Under braking, when you're braking, the car pitches forward, and now your front wing is really close to the ground, maybe even at that choking point, right? So that can make things very unpredictable if you're you're hard braking for a turn in into a corner, and you've lost all your front downforce, right? You're gonna understeer quite a bit, because you almost have no downforce on the front now. So these are considerations you have to keep in mind, when you're designing like a front wing and under tray working ground effect. Like, you have to keep it within the limits. You can't really run it too hard to the limits, because it changes so much dynamically that it can have pretty adverse effects on handling itself. And then you also have your center of pressure. Your center of pressure, think of it in essence your center of gravity, where your center of gravity is like the effective point where all the uh, mass, like all your weight acts. The center of pressure is the effective point where all of your aerodynamic forces act, right? Um, and your center of pressure is actually going to move, um, as you drive forward. So if you like think of this as an example, uh, as you start driving faster, right, you're producing more downforce, on the front and rear wing. What does that do? That's going to compress the suspension, right? Because the 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 wings are mounted onto the chassis, and it's sprung weight. So basically, all those forces are going to go through the suspension into the tires. So what that does is it compresses the suspension. Now, what happens when the suspension compresses? The front wing also gets closer to the ground, right? Now, what happens when the front wing gets closer to the ground? It produces more downforce. What's that going to do? Compress the front suspension even more. What does that do? Gets closer, the wing gets even closer to the ground, produces more downforce, right? So it basically goes in a loop. And what happens is that the faster you start to go, the more your front suspension will compress. The closer your front wing gets to the ground, you're producing a lot more front downforce as opposed to rear downforce. And what happens is that your center of pressure starts to move forward, right? Because now you have more effective forces acting on the front of the car as opposed to the rear, and your center of pressure moves forward, right? And what that basically equates to is you're getting more grip over the front tires and less over the rear tires. And what that's going to cause you to do on a high speed entry, for example, into a corner, is cause you to oversteer, because now you have a lot of grip on the front but not much on the back, and it's going to cause the back end to slide out at high speeds, right? So it can have an adverse effect on handling. So really, front wing is a really important thing that you need to tweak. The rear wing, usually, you try and get maximum downforce out of it. The front wing is what you use to balance everything, right? Um, and just another note on like center pressure, right? So if you have too much rear downforce and not enough front downforce, your center pressure is going to be too far towards the rear. Too much, you're going to have more grip on the rear, less on the front, and you're going to be understeering all the time. So that's why it's really important to balance the center of pressure, so that you can have like a neutral handling car, or have it as close to the center of gravity as possible. Um, or you can have it slightly forward or back depending on what type of like driver you have, and what if they prefer a more understeer car oversteer. But generally, you want to leave it somewhere around that neutral point. Uh, so I mean, this is a picture from one of our testing days. So you can see, I don't know who this is, but uh, under turning, you can see how like the car is sort of pitching and rolling, and you can see how the distance between the front wing and the ground here is a lot less than it is here. So in addition to just vertical variation, you're also going to have lateral variation, right? So now you're producing more downforce on one side as opposed to the other. um, so you have uneven distribution of downforce between the wheels, for example. And then you also have, like, if you mount it too low, then when you have a car that has that has a large range of roll, you're gonna have your end plate scraping against the ground, which is what happened to us. Our like basically by the end of the season, our end plates were just sanded down because they kept scraping against the ground. So that's like a future consideration. And then here you can see under acceleration. I think this is Chris driving. You can see how much you can see like the car pitching back, and you can see how like the distance between the front wing and the ground increases. So you'd probably be losing downforce in this scenario. Not that you really need it under acceleration much. I think the tire's off the ground here too, but it's Chris. So this is like this is an example of like this. I think it's a Le Mans car. Okay, so I'll come back to that video after. But basically, this is like a lot of words, but I'll just explain it real quick. This is the design process when basically starting in aerodynamic process. I mean, this is not the only one, but this is a recommended process. And basically, you start off at a point where you calculate your theoretical top speed without the wings, right? And you're basically doing this because the addition of wings is going to add drag, right? So you at max power, whatever, you can reach a certain theoretical top speed. Once you add wings, you're going to have additional drag, basically acting in the opposite direction of like the power you're producing. So the more drag you have, the more power you're going to need to overcome it, right? And generally you're going to have more drag from the rear wing as opposed to the front wing, just because it sticks out into the air a lot more. So you basically use that to so you see here, like, calculate the difference in power absorption between the top speed without wings and the top speed you're prepared to accept with wings, right? So maybe adding like this huge aero package is going to cause you to lose like 20 kilometers off your top speed. So you have to know how much you're losing off of that. Now, one advantage we have is that we generally never reach the top speeds of our car at the tracks we run at. So we generally have an excess of power anyways. So the drags of the wings itself doesn't actually affect us as much as it would, for example, like for an F1 car down a straight, right? Like in Canada, for example, like along the long straights, right? You want to have less drag. So for us, it doesn't make a huge difference because we already have an excess of power. We're not generally power limited; we're more traction limited. So, yeah, we have enough to donate in terms of power towards like the drag of the rear wing. And then from here, you can calculate like the maximum CD value that this represents. And you can do this by, figuring out what the actual box area is of where your wing would be. And you just generally work out like a general area and an approximate CD. And then from here, you can use an estimated lift to drag ratio to figure out what negative CL corresponds to this. In our case, we don't really do this. We actually use to get our CL targets. We actually use lapsums in optimum lap. So basically, seeing for our weight and how many points we want to get in all these events, what times would we need for these events, for example, right? So what time we need for skid pad, autocross, endurance, whatever. Okay, we have this time. What does that correspond to in terms of our car, right? We have a given weight, we have this, that, we have all these variables. What would the downforce be needed? What CL value would we need to be able to achieve the amount of downforce to be able to, do the skid pad in this amount of time, do the autocross and endurance in this amount of time. So we generally get our CL and CD targets from our lap sims, but and I think so our process is more a combination of both of this like theoretical design process and our lap sim data, because you have to remember this is just a theoretical thing, right? Just like a starting point, but we want to design it to our vehicle. So we're gonna, take the targets that we need from our lap sims of our vehicle. So generally, we design the front. We design the rear wing first to basically get maximum downforce we can, right? Like as much downforce as we can for that area. In terms of obviously keeping the fact that we can actually manufacture it. It works within the area, mounting, all that. And then we generally design the front wing to balance that, to balance the center of pressure, right? Because getting downforce from the rear wing, get as much as you can, because on the rear wing, because the front wing, it's relatively easier to make downforce, right? So we can balance that center of pressure around where we want by tweaking the front wing. Um, and then here you also have to figure out, how much ground clearance are we willing to keep. So here's where we have to work with vehicle dynamics to see, okay, what are like, how much are we pitching, what's our roll stiffness, um, all those things, so we can basically design the front wing to stay within its limits and not hit those like extreme cases where we lose downforce all of a sudden and spin out, for example. So, and then from here is where we like determine the actual airfoil profiles, how many elements we're going to use, all that sort of stuff, and then we move into CFD. So I think this is an example of like my calculations for, I think, RF18, like our first aero package. So we had a front area CD, how much maximum power we were producing, how much power was donated to drag, and then from there determining the rear wing and front wing dimension. It's just like an approximation of like what those calculations look like, and then this was just to see the actual envelope that we had for the rear wing. Oh, okay, I'm gonna go back to that video real quick because it loaded on the YouTube tab. So
Have to watch this again, as Dom is catching a little bit of air, and that was enough. Over 1.5 times in midair, and the car shatters upon impact. Look at that. And he walked away. Meanwhile, the race, 10 hours.
So yeah, so basically, if you saw in that video how um, what's happening is that you're producing a lot of downforce with that underbody, and then maybe because of like the car in front and the wake that's coming off of it, or some sort of ground clearance issues, the front, you basically like lost downforce. He basically lost downforce in that like single second, and the front end lifted up, and then a lot of air got under it, and it basically, if you were to look at that car from the side, with when the front end is slightly lifted up, is basically like a giant wing, right? All this air gets under the car and then just causes it to flip. And you'll actually, if you look up on YouTube, there's like a lot of cars actually. There's a lot of videos of especially WEC cars flipping, um, because their bottoms are so flat and they run so close to the ground that like any little uh, disturbances cause them to like really, have all the air go underneath the car and flip. So it's kind of interesting. So that's why it's very important to get your underbody aerodynamics right, because if anything messes up, that sort of stuff can happen. I'm almost like 99% sure not in our case, but it's still important. Um, yeah, I mean, like we wouldn't necessarily have to um simulate the downforce in SolidWorks. Like we can kind of see what the what do you say? How, I mean, we wouldn't even need air. You can kind of just see what the suspension travel is. Um, and then you can kind of see where you have your bump stop, and then that's basically as far down as it's going to go. So you want to make sure that when at that condition, your front wing still has enough clearance, right? You wouldn't necessarily need to simulate it, but yeah, so then you can kind of just like hand calculate it in a way. So you basically start your design there, like, okay, this is the maximum case where it is, and this is the maximum amount of, the minimum amount of space we're willing to leave. So let's put this rear wing, front wing here, if that makes sense. So yeah, the next step is CFD. So this method generally uses numerical analysis to solve the equation of fluid flow, which is the Navier-Stokes equations. So I'll quickly just show you what they look like. So this is a Navier-Stokes equation for like a particle in 3 dimensions. So there's no physical solution to this equation, and the only way to solve it is numerically, which is why it's like, you can see how many equations there are, and this is for uh, a single particle, right? So this is why you see why CFD takes so long, is because it's solving all these equations simultaneously within different control volumes to try and solve for the fluid flow. This is like the only, like, you can think of this as like, finite element but on steroids kind of thing. um it gets a lot larger, right? So these are all the equations. Now what you can do is simplify this to make it run, quicker. So for example, if you're running a 2D simulation, right, you can remove like z momentum, right? So now you only have x and y. If you only have like a single directional flow, you can take out y momentum. If you are ignoring viscosity, you can take out all like the uh, um, shear stress terms. If you're not concerned about energy, or if your flow is steady, you can take out a lot of the time dependent components, right? So, and you can see in here, there's things that are dependent on time. There's variables that are dependent on uh, coordinate positions like x, y, and z, and then things that are dependent on velocity in those three coordinate systems. Um, so there's a lot of dependencies, right? And to make your simulations run quicker and easier, you can simplify a lot of these things. So I'm sure most of you know the Bernoulli equation. Hopefully, I was talking about it before. The Bernoulli equation is actually is straight derived from these set of equations. It's just that if you notice, like all those um, assumptions you make, like incompressible laminar, like all those assumptions you're making, like steady state, like no heat transfer, no time dependence, all those simplifications you're making are basically chopping up sections of the equation, right? They're all just reducing it down to a single term. So if you look at the x momentum, this is that like pressure term, and then this is the 1/2 like rho v squared, right? This is the rho v squared part, and then this is the actual uh, the static pressure portion in the Bernoulli's equation. So you can see how like one's negative, one's positive, which is why an increase in velocity causes a decrease in pressure. So the Bernoulli equation is basically canceling out this whole bottom section here, right? And cutting this out, cutting that out, cutting this out, cutting all this out, and gets simplified to just this and this, but expanded out of the partial derivatives to like a form we use. But you can see like how much simplification there is, which is why like equations like Bernoulli's equation are good for getting a general understanding, but there's so much more that goes on in a flow that you need to capture. So that's why it does take so long to run a lot of these simulations, because you're running this numerical simulation um, within mesh, within like mesh volume. So I'll explain that right now. So basically, yeah, it's used as a tool. You have to remember, very important, that it's only a tool to obtain aerodynamic data and flow visualization. You can't take what CFD says and be like, I'm 100% sure that this is what our car is producing, because 100% of the time you're going to be wrong, like 100% of the time. And it's very important to also understand what's going on behind the scenes, right? Like you to understand all these equations, what they mean, what they're doing, how they relate to your simulations, because only when you understand those equations do you understand what's going on. Otherwise, it's pretty easy to use a program. You can just kind of click a bunch of buttons, run a simulation, get some results, and you'll be like, all right, sick. You know, our car produces 10,000 pounds of downforce. That's what CFD said. Not necessarily going to be the case, right? Because you need to understand the setup. If you understand the equations, you can kind of understand how to set up, you know, do I need to use, what type of mesh do I need to use? Do I need to use this type? Do I need to use transient? Do I need to use steady state, time dependent? You know, do I want to include viscosity, not include viscosity? So understanding the actual problem, what variables it involves, and all, and like what input variables you're putting it in, and how that translates into the setup of your actual CFD, even before you run anything, run any simulations, you really need to get the setup done. Your solution will only be as good as your setup is. So that's why it's very important to understand what's going on, because you can always get any sort of results, but if you don't understand what those results are saying, and if they're, you know, they look correct or whatever, um you're just going to be basically, like my CFD prof said, garbage in, garbage out, right? Like it basically, you just get a bunch of numbers at the end that basically means nothing. um so basically the huge domain, right? So you have this giant volume domain that's air, and then you have your car. And that air domain is discretized into elements or volumes depending on the type of simulation. So, and this is known as the mesh. So finite element method has like is elements. CFD uses finite volume method, which means that it's not 2D elements, they're actually volumes, right? So if you look here on this side, this is just an example of the mesh around an airfoil. You can see here that these aren't just 2D. They have depth to them. They have a certain volume to them, and different shapes too. But this is what you'd use in CFD versus like in finite elements, where they're like 2D elements on the actual surface, because you're trying to get surface stresses, while in CFD you're trying to get volume, like forces, body forces in a volume. So that's also why it takes longer. Now you have a volume as opposed to just a 2D plane. Uh, just so that I mean, you can have structured or unstructured mesh types. So structured means that, you know, um, all the actual mesh elements are square. They have a certain aspect ratio to them, and uh, they're larger outside, smaller closer to the body to capture the boundary layer. An unstructured mesh will usually be, it can actually be a variety of shapes. Like this is a triangular mesh that's unstructured. This one uses, I think, hexagonal elements. So there's a lot of different types of meshes, and knowing what type of mesh you use is pretty important uh, to have a good simulation, because you know, in some, by using some types of meshes, you won't be able to capture some of the flow effects. And your mesh is the most important part, because that's what, inside each of these little cubes or little volumes, all of these equations are being run, right? Inside every single uh, volume that you have in your mesh, all those equations are being run. So the way your mesh is set up is really important, and you know how dense your mesh is closer to certain areas. If you look here, it's very small near this area, because the boundary layer changes very quickly near an object. So you need to capture all those changes, while nothing much happens far away. So you can have big gaps between them, because the data will almost be the same between different mesh structures. So yeah, mesh is really, really important. Probably one of the most important parts of getting a CFD simulation right. This is there's just like a video from one of our CFD simulations of like a pressure sweep across the car. So it's starting from front to back, and it's just like a plane cutting through the car, and you can see how the pressure changes around the whole vehicle. So Sina, there is rules. So there's okay. One of the main things is firstly getting your boundary layer mesh like close to the actual surface has to be a certain size, and that's actually known as a Y plus value. And that basically defines like the actual aspect ratio of the mesh close to the body surface to the size of the boundary layer. So that's like an important consideration around near body. And then around the actual rest of the vehicle, uh, you can start off at like, you can kind of, I wouldn't say that there's like a very rule of thumb. It's more, um, you you kind of get an intuitive sense of what mesh sizes work for what type of like problem you're trying to solve. Um, so you have like a general mesh size around the rest of your car, and then you have refinement regions, right? So things where there's flow effects happening, right? Like around the wings, around the like close to the body, near the wheels. You want to have finer mesh there to capture all the little changes in variations in the pressure and velocity. Behind the car, you want to have a refinement region because there's the wake there, and that changes very quickly in space and time. So you want to have a fine refinement there. Farther away, you want to have not that much refinement because very far in front of the car, there's really nothing happening. So there's no point in wasting resources. You could probably, I'm not 100% sure what a minimum mesh size rule of thumb would be. Um, I've kind of gotten it more through just working on CFD and intuition, but I'm almost sure that there is some basic guidelines that you could probably see in like some CFD books or like CFD tutorials or something that there is like a general guideline to it. Hope that answers it. Okay, validation technique. So, we get all this data from our design, CFD, all that sort of stuff. It's almost useless unless you have real data to validate against, right? You need something in real life to prove that your simulations work, right? You don't, your real life results give validation to your simulations, not the other way around. So there's two main types of validation techniques we use or actually generally is wind tunnel testing. So this can be scale model or full vehicle wind tunnel testing, and on track testing. So it's just like a picture of one. I don't know which FSA team, but with a scale model in the wind tunnel. It's like a small 3D printed model. Um, there's a lot of issues that come with scale model testing, um, but I will not go into those right now because of time. Um, So yeah, full scale wind tunnel testing is very beneficial because you can control a lot of the variables, right? Versus on track, you can control the airspeed, you can control the temperature. In the case of like, for example, this is our picture. I mean, this is a picture of our car at the UIT wind tunnel that we took this summer. This is a full size wind tunnel. Uh, this one doesn't have a rolling road, which basically means that the tires are also spinning. In this case, the tires were not spinning. But if you do have a rolling road where the tires can spin, because the tire produces wake and stuff too, you can control that too. The speed of the car, the speed of the tires. You can control the angle the car is at. You can control like uh, the different wing angles and stuff. So you have a lot more control in a wind tunnel. And then there's load cells at every wheel that measure the downforce and drag at the individual wheels, so you can get accurate numbers at different speeds. So you can create like a full graph of how your downforce changes. You can use smoke and other forms of flow visualization to actually see what the flow is doing. So like I'll just go back really quick. You look at the first page. So this is a picture from the wind tunnel as well. And we're able to see that. Remember, I was talking about that vortex that comes off the tip of the wings. So we were actually able to visualize that vortex with the smoke and actually be able to see how it forms, which is actually really cool. Credits to Cena for that picture and this one, actually. Um, So you can really get the car to a steady state and objectively see what the downforce and drag values you have, and you can make quick modifications. Right, you can do a run, come back, change your wing angle of attack, go back inside, run the tunnel. You can go through a lot of design iterations. When we were at the wind tunnel, Polytech Montreal was there, and I think they had like 40 to 50 iterations that they did. So that was pretty impressive. The main con is that it's super expensive, like hella expensive. The only reason we were able to get in was because the UIT FSAE team set up like this special sort of day where we had to pay a reduced price. So that's why we went. Otherwise, it's like it's way too much to afford. So there's on track testing. You could say it's the most accurate because you're testing when it's in a real operating scenario. Um, the main equipment you need is a pitot tube. So you can see here on ETS's car, this is a pitot tube, and it's used to measure the airspeed, right? Your ground speed doesn't matter. Like I said, your wings don't care how fast you're moving your car, your wheels are rolling over the ground. Your wings care how much air is flowing over them, and that's airspeed. So that's why we use a pitot tube to measure airspeed as opposed to just ground speed, because that's the speed of the air going over the actual wings. Potentiometer measures suspension travel. Like I said, the wings are mounted to the frame, so all the forces that are produced go through the suspension. So by seeing how much the suspension compresses, we can see how much downforce is produced. Data acquisition system to measure all of this, and then pressure taps, which are mainly used on the under tray because you can't really put load cells on the under tray per se. I mean, you could, but the pressure taps basically measure the pressure at different points under on the surface of the under tray. The three main tests that we use in track testing is coast down test. So basically, you take your car up to a certain speed, like 60 kilometers an hour, and then you just come off the throttle and you let the car come to a stop itself, and then you can calculate what your drag is. Like you subtract out what the rolling resistance is, and then you can see, okay, it took me this long to decelerate, this is what our drag is. Straight line test, which is where you basically gun it down, you accelerate to 60 kilometers an hour, for example, hold it there for as long as you can, like let's say like 100 meters, and then your potentiometers will reach to a steady state, and then you can see, okay, at 60 kilometers we produce this much downforce, at 20 this much, and you can try a bunch of different straight line tests at different speeds. And then there's steady state cornering, so you get into a skid pad and you basically try and get as steady as you can going around the skid pad, pushing the limit, and then you can see what your lateral acceleration is, how many g's you're pulling laterally and with and without wings, and you can kind of see, how much lateral G's you're pulling and how much faster you're going. Yes, they can. So Polytech, when they came in the tunnel, there was no rolling road, so they put on they taped these flaps onto the tires to basically cause the flow to separate over the wheel to simulate the actual tire spinning, even though they weren't. So it was kind of like a workaround to getting around a rolling road. And then this I just wanted to show you. This is Too Fast from Berlin, I think, their car. And this is probably the best FSAE aero car in the world, and you can see just how complex it is. This is like a gold standard to reach to, but just to see what's possible in terms of aero. I think that they can drive upside down because they produce so much downforce. Like if they could drive upside down at it's like 100 kilometers an hour or something, it's like some really low speed that they could basically produce so much force in downforce that they could drive upside down. So yeah, this is like just the extent of what's possible with aero. It's really really an impressive car. So take inspiration. And this is a preview of our wing for this year's car. So kind of on pause, but that's what it looks like so far. So do you guys have any questions or anything? I'm not exactly 100% sure. I know Antonio's looked more into this. Antonio, are you still here?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, I was kind of curious because I saw some other teams were running it. And I looked into why, and basically the second stack creates a vortex, and it helps shed the vortex a bit better because like that low pressure air obviously hurts the high pressure air that the regular section of the wing is trying to build. So if you can help free that vortex, it doesn't interfere as much with the second and third element. So there's a bit of a pressure separation, which helps it be more effective. And yeah, I think we noticed a downforce gain of about 4 to 5 pounds with that in CFD. So it showed some gains, and judging by the fact that some other teams use it as well, especially a few good teams, it does show that maybe our theory behind that is right. So yeah.
We won't know until we
Yeah,
validate
and also the second stack, second element, starts to have a bit of high pressure on like at the as the bottom at the bottom side as it approaches the trailing edge. So that actually the cutout is placed pretty close to the end of the element and helps to kind of vent out that high pressure air. And I guess also the fact that that high pressure air on the bottom is moving. Sorry, there's low pressure air on the bottom, but by the time it gets up to the trailing edge, it's kind of moving a bit slower as it reaches the regular air. You can also think of it as this: as the air passes along the side of the end plate, that's pretty much free stream if you don't really account for all that drag, like surface drag. You can also think of the fact that the air moving along the side of the end plate could be moving a bit quicker, which kind of helps to pull more air under the wing as well. That's another thing that could be acting on this as well. But again, just theories. They seem to make sense. But yeah, I guess we'll see. Oh, and then for the people that are still here, show the Mercedes that I sent you on Slack, because they talked about that in the in race car aerodynamics. If you can show it.
Can you guys see it?
Yeah.
Toyota, lights ablaze. Make sure the slower cars see them. Here we go. Oh my God, oh my God, the Mercedes has taken off. That's Peter Dumbreck at the wheel of the number 5 Mercedes. The car flew right up into the air, over the barriers, over the wire, and into the trees. Let's look at this again.
So it's pretty drastic how they
show it. An awful accident. He moves out of the slipstream of the Toyota, and the car just takes off. That looks horrifically like a replay of what happened to Mark Webber, who I hasten to add, but that's a big impact.
That's
Look
crazy.
At the earth thrown up. That is a very big impact.
Yeah, that's why like at higher things, like it just gets like the stakes get a lot higher when you're running at high speeds, and you can.
Yeah. If you look at like designing a WEC car, which is that Porsche you showed was also from that same era. They race on really long straights, and they're meant to reach really high speeds, over 350, 360 kilometers an hour. So they're really drag sensitive if you're doing like a pointed sensitivity thing, if you think about it. So they rely heavily on underfloor aero, and that's why their rear wings are typically placed lower, so they don't take up more frontal area, first of all, and they're not really set to a high angle of attack. And basically what was found with that Mercedes and most cars of that era is that they're still really sensitive to obviously suspension and ride height changes. And what would happen is the front part of the car, like the splitter, was in ground effect, so it would produce downforce. But then as you're moving over the bumpy straights of the track, it would kind of
raise off the ground.
But then you'd produce a lot of downforce, and then it would kind of go close to the ground, and then because you had too much downforce and it compressed the suspension too much, it choked the flow. So then you would lose all downforce. So it would kind of like it was almost like bouncing the front end of the car, and they call it porpoising. And what ended up happening was, at some bumpy parts of the track, coupled with the effect of porpoising, it would make the car flip up, and essentially because the bottom is a flat plate, it would make the cars fly. They're still pretty cool cars. It's just and like Mercedes that weekend, actually, after those 2 incidents, because they had that happen to both of their cars, they had to actually remove some body work to stop it being so sensitive.
Facts.
So yeah, it just goes to show you, no matter what level of motorsports you are, you think you have all this experience, yet you still make fatal mistakes, even though nobody died, but you still make mistakes that are, that bad.
Well, thank you. Hopefully you guys learned about aero. basically enough to understand what goes on our car and why we do the things that we do. And yeah, hope you enjoyed it and have a better knowledge of things.